By the time the bank nailed the notice to her door, Eleanor Pruitt had already sold her mother's silver spoons, her husband's pocket watch, and the roan mare that had pulled their wagon for 11 faithful years. What remained of a life fit into one trunk, one canvas sack, and the $31 folded into her glove. Her husband, Thomas, had been dead 8 months, thrown from a wagon on a rain-slicked grade, and the farm had gone with him, swallowed whole by a debt she never knew he'd carried. When the auctioneer's gavel fell on the last of their furniture, the whole of Larkspur Hollow turned out to watch, and not one of them looked away out of kindness. So when Eleanor spent nearly every dollar she had left on a worthless, forgotten mining claim nobody had touched in 80 years, the town didn't whisper. They laughed outright. A widow, alone but for a rangy red dog, throwing away her last money on frozen ground and rotted timber. It was, they agreed, the final proof that grief had cost her her good sense. They did not know what the dog already knew, walking circles at her heel, tail low, nose lifted to a wind that smelled of something the town had buried and forgotten. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Pruitt and her faithful dog Copper. Before we go on, if you've ever felt like the underdog the world had already written off, or found something worth more than gold in a place everyone else overlooked, tell us in the comments. We read every one. 3 years earlier, nobody in Larkspur Hollow would have called Eleanor Pruitt unlucky. She and Thomas had 160 acres of good bottomland, a 2-room house he'd built with his own hands, and a marriage that neighbors still spoke of as an example, not because it was without hardship, but because of how the two of them met hardship together. Thomas Pruitt was not a large man, but he had a large laugh, and he'd carried Eleanor over the threshold of their unfinished house before the roof was even shingled, promising her the rest would come. It had. Slowly, and with the kind of labor that turns a young woman's hands rough and her back strong, the farm became something to be proud of. They raised hogs and put in wheat, and on Sunday evenings, Thomas would sit on the porch step with Copper's mother, a red hound named Biscuit, asleep across his boots, and say that he didn't know a happier man in the territory. Nobody speaks of the exact moment a good life starts to come undone, because it rarely announces itself. For Eleanor, it began with a banknote Thomas had signed 2 winters before, quietly, to cover a bad season, and never mentioned again, because he believed, rightly, as it turned out, until it didn't, that the next harvest would clear it. It very nearly did. But the note had passed, through a series of transactions Eleanor would only later understand, into the hands of Larkspur Hollow's most prosperous citizen, a banker and land agent named Silas Kane, a man who wore his Sunday suit on weekdays, and had a way of speaking to widows and debtors as though he pitied them, right up until the moment he took what he wanted from them. Thomas died in March, on a grade slick with spring runoff, his wagon wheel catching a rut that threw him beneath it. Eleanor buried him on a Tuesday, with more of the town in attendance than had come to their wedding, and by Friday, Silas Kane had already sent a boy round with a letter reminding the widow Pruitt that the note was now due in full, per the terms her late husband had signed. There was no cruelty in his letter that a court would recognize. There rarely was, in Kane's dealings. He simply followed the law, precisely, at the exact moment it would do the most damage, and smiled while he did it. Eleanor fought for 6 months. She sold hogs at half their worth, took in mending, sold the good china her mother had carried west in a hope chest. She stood in the bank's front office more than once, asking, not begging, though it must have felt close to it some days, for time, for patience, for the small mercy of a season to bring in one more harvest. Sick Kane always heard her out with folded hands and a sorrowful tilt of the head, and always arrived, by the end of the conversation, at the same answer. The bank had rules, and rules were not unkind, they were simply rules. The town watched this unfold the way towns watch most things, with sympathy that cost them nothing, and did her no good. The auction came in October. Eleanor stood at the edge of her own dooryard, while strangers picked through the life she and Thomas had built, and she held herself so straight and so still, that more than one neighbor remarked, admiringly, on her composure, never once guessing that the stillness was the only thing keeping her upright. Copper, not yet a year old, pressed himself against her skirts the whole afternoon, ears back, growling low at anyone who came too near her, until she had to keep a hand on his scruff to remind him there was nothing left worth defending. When the gavel came down on the house itself, purchased by a rancher who intended to tear it apart for the lumber, Eleanor did not cry. She had already decided, sometime in the small hours of that week, that Larkspur Hollow would not have the satisfaction of her tears in daylight. What the town did not know, what only Copper seemed to sense, the way dogs sense weather before it arrives, was that grief had not broken Eleanor Pruitt. It had simply cleared out everything in her that wasn't stubbornness, and left the stubbornness standing. She had $31 and no home. She had heard, from the same courthouse clerk who processed her foreclosure, that an old abandoned mining claim 11 miles up Hollow Ridge, land so worthless the county had been trying to unload it in back taxes for 2 decades, could be had for a fraction of what it would take to rent a single room above the Mercantile. The camp had been called Marshs' Folly, by the men who worked it, and abandoned, all at once, in the winter of 1817, 80 years past, when the vein ran dry, or so the story went, though nobody in Larkspur Hollow could say for certain, because nobody who'd been there was still alive to ask. It sat frozen on the mountainside, cabins standing, tools still hung on their pegs, as though the miners had simply walked away one afternoon, and never come back. Eleanor bought the claim for $26 at the county office, and the clerk, a kind enough man named Pruitt, in no relation to her at all, told her gently that she'd be better off keeping her money for a train ticket east. She thanked him for his concern and told him she wasn't going east. She had nowhere east to go, and she had, if nothing else, 4 walls and a roof waiting for her on that mountain, however old, however forgotten. That was more than the town's charity had offered her. Word of the purchase moved through Larkspur Hollow faster than the wildfire smoke that sometimes rolled down off the ridges in August. By the time Eleanor loaded her trunk onto a borrowed cart, half the town had already decided what to think of her. A woman alone, buying dead ground 80 years cold, with nothing but a red dog for protection, it confirmed what grief and misfortune had apparently done to her judgment. Old Mrs. Kettering told the mercantile owner's wife, in a voice not nearly as low as she believed it to be, that the poor woman had gone soft in the head from sorrow. Silas Kane, informed of the sale by his own courthouse contacts, only smiled, and remarked to his clerk that some people simply couldn't be saved from themselves, a comment that would come to seem, in time, considerably less kind than he intended it, and considerably more revealing. Eleanor heard every word of it, one way or another, before she left. She said nothing in her own defense. She had learned, in the worst year of her life, that defending yourself to people who have already decided your worth is a battle with no bottom to it. She loaded her trunk, whistled for Copper, and turned the cart up the mountain road toward Hollow Ridge without looking back at the town that had watched her lose everything and called it entertainment. What she didn't yet know, what none of Larkspur Hollow knew, was that Marshs' Folly hadn't gone quiet because the vein ran dry. It had gone quiet because of what the last man to leave it had buried there, and why. The road to Hollow Ridge climbed through stands of lodgepole pine that grew close and dark, filtering the October light into thin gold coins that scattered across the trail. The higher they climbed, the quieter the world became, until the only sounds left were the cartwheels grinding over stone and Copper's steady panting where he trotted alongside, nose working the air in a way that made Eleanor watch him more closely the nearer they came. Dogs, she had noticed, over a year of Copper's company, did not waste attention. When his ears came up and stayed up, there was usually a reason. They crested the last rise as the light was going long and amber, and the camp appeared below them all at once, the way forgotten things sometimes do, not gradually, but suddenly whole, as if it had been waiting the entire time to be seen. Marshs' Folly sat in a shallow bowl of the mountainside, a scatter of a dozen log structures silvered by 80 winters, a broken sluice trailing down toward a creek gone quiet with algae, and above it all, cut into the rock face like a black wound, the mouth of the mine itself. Nothing moved. No birds called from the timber near the buildings, though they sang freely enough in the trees behind her. Eleanor sat on the cart seat a long moment, taking in the strange, held-breath stillness of the place, and beside her, Copper had gone rigid, a low whine building in his throat that was not fear, she would come to understand later, but something closer to recognition. She made camp in the sturdiest of the cabins, a 2-room structure that must once have belonged to the claim's foreman, judging by its size, and the remains of a real bedstead inside rather than a bunk. The door hung crooked on one hinge. Inside, dust lay thick over everything: a table, 2 chairs, a cold stove, a shelf of tin cups gone green with age, undisturbed for 8 decades except by mice and weather. The air smelled of old pine pitch and rust, and something colder beneath it, mineral and faintly metallic, the smell, she would later think, of a held secret. She swept what she could, propped the door as best she was able, and told herself, with more conviction than she felt, that a roof was a roof, whatever its age, and she had slept under worse since October began. Copper would not settle. He paced the cabin's perimeter twice, sniffed at the hearth, the doorframe, the corner where the floor met the wall, and then, near the foot of the old bedstead, he stopped entirely and began to dig, his claws scraping hard against floorboards that had not been disturbed since before Eleanor's own grandmother was born. She called him off twice, and twice he returned to the same spot, whining now, high and insistent, pawing at a floorboard that, she noticed only once she knelt to see what had so fixed his attention, sat very slightly higher than the boards around it, its edge worn smooth in a way that suggested it had been lifted many times by a hand that knew exactly where to find purchase. It took her the better part of an hour, working by lamplight with a bent fire iron, to pry the board free. Beneath it lay a shallow cavity dug into the earth below the cabin floor, and inside that cavity, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, and was now little more than brittle fragments, sat a small iron strongbox, rusted nearly solid, and beside it, a leather-bound ledger, whose cover had gone stiff and dark with age, but whose pages, when she coaxed the cover open with trembling fingers, had survived remarkably whole in the dry mountain air. Copper pressed his head against her shoulder as she read, not with the idle curiosity of a dog investigating a smell, but with the stillness of an animal standing guard over something he understood, in whatever way dogs understand such things, to matter. The ledger was written in a tight, careful hand, dated across a span of months in 1817, and it belonged, according to the signature on its first page, to a man named Jedediah Marsh, the very man the camp had been named for, and the very man local legend claimed had simply vanished into the mountains one winter, never to be seen again. The early entries were ordinary enough: ore counts, wages paid to a dozen men, complaints about a foreman named Pruitt who watered the whiskey ration, but the later pages told a different story, one that made Eleanor's hands go cold on the brittle paper. Marsh had discovered, buried in the accounts he kept separate from the camp's official books, that the assay reports being sent down to the Territorial Land Office were being deliberately falsified, not to hide a poor vein, as everyone believed, but to hide a rich one, so that the claim's true value could be quietly bought up cheap by a man Marsh named only as C, who had a partner in the land office willing to file the false paperwork that would let Marsh's Folly be recorded as exhausted and worthless, ripe for a quiet, dirt-cheap purchase once the miners scattered. Marsh had confronted the man, and then, according to the ledger's final entry, dated the night before the whole camp abruptly disbanded, and its miners scattered to other territories with a season's pay in their pockets, and instructions never to speak of what they'd found, Jedediah Marsh had hidden his proof, his ore samples, and this ledger, intending to carry the truth down the mountain to the territorial governor himself. He never made it. No one, in 80 years, had ever found out why. It was, Eleanor realized, staring at that final unfinished entry by lamplight, not a story about a mine that had run dry at all. It was a story about a theft that had never been discovered, and she had just become the only living person who knew it. She did not sleep well that first night, though not from fear. Copper lay across the cabin's threshold rather than at the foot of her bed, an unusual choice for a dog who ordinarily slept pressed against her side, and twice in the night, he lifted his head at some sound she could not hear, ears swiveling toward the dark beyond the door before he settled again, apparently satisfied. In the morning, she carried the strong box out into daylight and worked the rusted latch open with a chisel, and inside, found not gold, as she half expected, but a small canvas pouch of raw ore samples, heavier than their size suggested, threaded through with veins of pale, unmistakable metal, and a folded map, hand-drawn, marking a second location on the claim, a spot Marsh had labeled only as the true vein, some distance from the played-out tunnel the camp had officially worked. Over the following days, Eleanor did what any sensible woman with no money and no other choices would do. She stayed, and she worked, and she let Copper lead her. It became, without her quite deciding it should, a kind of partnership. She would clear brush from the old trail toward the second tunnel mouth Marsh's map indicated, and Copper would range ahead of her, sniffing at rockfalls and rotted timber supports, and more than once his behavior told her which sections of old tunnel were sound enough to enter and which were not, backing away, stiff-legged and growling, from a section of shoring that, when she inspected it herself the next morning by daylight, she found rotted through and ready to collapse at a touch. She took his warning seriously, and never once let him inside the tunnels himself, keeping him always at the entrance where the air was clean and the footing certain, no matter how he whined to follow her deeper. It took her nearly 2 weeks of careful, solitary labor, shoring up a stretch of collapsed passage with fresh-cut timber, clearing rubble with a borrowed pick she'd traded a morning's mending for at the general store in a nearby settlement, smaller and kinder than Larkspur Hollow, before she reached the chamber Marsh's map had promised. What she found there, glinting faintly in her lamplight along a vein thick as her forearm, was silver, not the played-out trace the official records claimed, but a rich unmistakable seam that would have made Marsh's Folly one of the most valuable claims in the territory, had the truth ever reached the land office instead of a grave nobody had found. She sat a long while in that chamber. Copper's warm weight leaned against her side, just inside the tunnel mouth where she'd made him wait, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after the chaos of the past year, exactly what she now held. Not merely a fortune, though it was certainly that, but the truth about a fraud, 80 years buried, and the name of the man behind it, recorded in Jedediah Marsh's own careful hand, a name she recognized instantly, because it matched, letter for letter, the family name of the very banker who had taken her farm. News travels strangely in mountain country, slower than a train, but with a persistence that outlasts any effort to contain it. Eleanor had told no one in Larkspur Hollow what she'd found. She had gone down only once, briefly, to file the proper paperwork confirming her claim was active and being worked, as the law required to hold it. A visit she made deliberately plain and unremarkable, offering no details, letting the clerk assume whatever he liked. But a boy from the smaller settlement, where she'd traded mending for tools, had mentioned, innocently, to a peddler passing through, that the widow up at the old Marsh camp had been buying an unusual quantity of lamp oil and fresh timber, for a claim everyone knew was worthless. The peddler mentioned it in Larkspur Hollow. And within a fortnight, the news had reached exactly the one man Eleanor had most hoped it would not. Silas Kane did not visit the claim himself, not at first. He was, whatever else could be said of him, a careful man, and careful men rarely reveal their hand before they understand the board. Instead, he sent his clerk quietly to the county office to review the exact terms of Eleanor's purchase, and what the clerk found there troubled him enough to bring straight back. The original 1817 survey filed for Marsh's Folly, buried deep in records nobody had examined in decades, did not match the boundaries the claim had been sold under for the past 80 years. Somewhere, sometime, the paperwork had been altered, shifted, ever so slightly, to place the claim's richest ground just outside its official boundary, in a strip of land that had, through a separate and much more recent transaction, become the private property of one Silas Kane. It was, Eleanor would later understand, the same fraud twice committed, the first time by a father none of the current town remembered well enough to suspect, the second time inherited, quite literally, by his son, who had built his entire fortune and reputation in Larkspur Hollow on ground his family had stolen from a man who vanished trying to expose it. And that, we should tell you now, is exactly the moment the story stopped being about a discovery, and became a fight to keep it. Kane came to the mountain himself on a gray morning in early November, with 2 hired men and a lawyer's letter drafted to look far more official than its actual standing warranted, claiming that a survey discrepancy required Eleanor to vacate the disputed section of the claim immediately, pending review. He had expected, by every account of how he had handled widows before, to find a frightened woman who would fold at the sight of legal paper and the presence of hired men twice her size. He found instead a woman standing calmly in her cabin doorway with a rifle broken open over her arm, not raised, not threatening, simply present, the way a fact is present, and a rangy red dog planted at her side, hackles raised, a low growl rolling continuously in his chest, though he did not lunge, did not need to, because his stillness said everything his teeth might have. Eleanor did not invite Cain inside. She read his letter standing in the doorway, handed it back to him without comment, and told him that she'd be very glad to discuss the survey discrepancy, at the county office, in front of the land commissioner, with the original 1817 survey, and Jedediah Marsh's ledger both laid out on the table between them. It was the first time, by the visible change in his composure, that Silas Cain had heard the name Marsh spoken aloud in connection with his own family, in a very long time, and it landed on him, the way a name from a buried past always lands on a man who thought he'd buried it well enough. He left the mountain without pressing the matter further that day, but Eleanor understood the reprieve for exactly what it was, not a retreat, but a regrouping. That night, for the first time since she'd arrived at the camp, Copper would not settle at all. He paced the cabin from wall to wall, ears pricked toward the dark timber beyond the window, and near midnight, he began to bark in earnest, a sharp, sustained alarm unlike any sound she'd heard from him before. Eleanor extinguished her lamp, took up the rifle, and waited in the dark, and within minutes, she heard what Copper had heard first, footsteps moving carefully through the old camp outside, more than one set, pausing near the mine entrance she had spent 2 weeks reopening. She did not go out to confront them in the dark. She was sensible enough, whatever the town believed of her judgment, to know that a woman alone at midnight gains nothing by meeting armed men on their own terms. Instead, she kept Copper close inside with her, his growl low and continuous at the door, and in the morning found exactly what she'd expected. The timber shoring at the tunnel mouth had been deliberately loosened, an act meant to look like accident or age, but one that would have collapsed the passage, and buried, permanently, both the vein and the truth about it, had anyone tried to enter it that day. It was, Eleanor realized, with a coldness that steadied rather than frightened her, no longer a matter of a paperwork dispute. It had become a matter of what a man would do to keep 80 years of theft buried a little longer, and she understood that she could not fight that alone, on a mountainside, with only a rifle and a dog for company, however loyal that dog had proven himself. She needed the truth to reach more people than herself before Cain found a way to bury it, and her along with it, if it came to that. She rode down to the smaller settlement the next morning, not to Larkspur Hollow, and found there a circuit judge, who happened to be passing through on his regular rounds, a stern, unhurried man, named Judge Aldous Reyes, who had, as it turned out, no particular fondness for Silas Cain, having crossed him once before over a separate matter of disputed water rights, and come away from it, with a low opinion of the banker's honesty. Eleanor laid the entire matter before him, the ledger, the ore samples, the mismatched survey her own courthouse visit had confirmed, and Judge Reyes, reading Jedediah Marsh's careful hand by lamplight, in a rented room above a feed store, went very quiet for a long while before telling her that he would ride to Larkspur Hollow himself, within the week, to review the matter formally, with both parties present. Word of the judge's coming visit reached Silas Cain before Eleanor herself did, as such things often will in a small territory, and it changed the shape of his strategy entirely. A man who could threaten a widow alone on a mountainside could not so easily threaten a circuit judge with a reputation for thoroughness, and Cain understood, with the same careful calculation that had built his fortune, that his best remaining chance lay not in intimidation, but in destroying the evidence before it could be formally reviewed. He returned to the mountain a second time, this time without pretense of legal paperwork, arriving in the gray hour before dawn with the same 2 hired men, intending, Eleanor would only piece this together afterward, from what the men themselves later admitted under the judge's questioning, to seize the ledger and the ore samples outright, and leave nothing behind for any judge to examine. Copper heard them coming while they were still a quarter mile off, moving quietly through the timber, and this time his alarm was different, not the sustained bark of the previous night, but something lower, more urgent, a sound that had Eleanor awake and dressed and out the cabin door, with the ledger and ore pouch already wrapped in oilcloth and hidden inside her coat, before the first of the men reached the clearing. She did not run. She had decided, somewhere in the days since Cain's first visit, that she would not spend one more moment of her life running from what belonged to her. Instead, she took Copper, and moved not toward the cabin, where the men clearly expected to find her, but up along the old sluice trail, toward the smaller settlement, keeping to the timber, letting the dog's nose and ears guide her past two separate points, where the hired men had stationed themselves to watch the main trail. It was, in the end, Copper who found the way through. Working ahead of her along a game trail she would never have located herself in the dark, doubling back once to nudge her firmly away from a stretch of loose scree that would have sent stone clattering down the slope and announced her position to anyone listening below. He led her clear of the camp entirely, down through 2 miles of dark timber, to the settlement road just as the first gray light of morning was breaking, and there, coming up the road toward them exactly on schedule, rode Judge Reyes himself, a day earlier than expected, with a territorial deputy at his side. What happened next, we should say plainly, is the part of this story Larkspur Hollow still talks about, though not, these days, the way they once talked about the widow who bought worthless ground. The formal hearing convened 3 days later in Larkspur Hollow's small courthouse, and half the town crowded in to watch, the same half that had gathered at Eleanor's auction to watch her lose everything, though their expressions this time carried considerably less certainty. Judge Reyes laid Jedediah Marsh's ledger open on the bench before him, and read the relevant passages aloud, in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, and as he read the name C. And then, drawing on the county's own buried 1817 survey records, confirmed precisely how that survey had been altered, and by whose family the resulting land had passed into private hands, Silas Kane's careful composure finally, publicly, broke. He tried, in the end, exactly what desperate men in his position generally try. He claimed the ledger was a forgery, the ore samples planted, the widow Pruitt herself, an opportunist inventing a fraud to seize land she had no right to. But the judge had already sent his deputy to examine the loosened timber shoring at the mine entrance, and take statements from Kane's own hired men, who, faced with a territorial deputy and no particular loyalty to a man who had never paid them enough to risk prison for him, admitted readily enough who had ordered the sabotage and why. The physical evidence, the altered survey records held in the county's own vault, and the testimony together, left Judge Reyes very little room for doubt, and even less patience for a man who had spent a formal legal hearing lying to his face. The judgment, when it came, was thorough. The original 1817 survey was restored as the legal boundary of Eleanor's claim, returning to her not only the silver vein, but the strip of land Kane's family had fraudulently carved away from it 80 years before, land on which, it turned out, a considerable portion of Kane's own bank building and warehouse now stood, built, quite literally, on stolen ground. Kane faced charges for the attempted destruction of the mine, and the assault implicit in sending armed men to seize property that was not his, and while the territory's frontier justice moved slowly and imperfectly by any modern measure, it moved decisively enough to strip him of his banking charter within the month, and see him leave Larkspur Hollow entirely before winter's end. His fortune and his family's long-buried theft, both laid bare for a town that had once trusted him with everything they owned. Eleanor Pruitt, meanwhile, became in the space of a single winter, the wealthiest woman in that stretch of the territory, and to her considerable credit, she did not let it change the plain good sense that had carried her through the worst year of her life. She did not build herself a mansion in Larkspur Hollow, though she could easily have afforded one. Instead, she used the first proceeds from the silver to pay off, quietly and without fanfare, the debts of 3 other families in the district who had lost land to Kane's bank, under circumstances not unlike her own, and she funded, before that first winter ended, the construction of a proper schoolhouse for the settlement that had given her a kind judge and honest neighbors, when Larkspur Hollow had given her only laughter. She kept the old foreman's cabin at Marsh's Folly standing, restored rather than replaced, and had a small plaque set near its door bearing Jedediah Marsh's name and the truth of what he'd died trying to tell the world 80 years too late for anyone to thank him properly. Copper, for his part, spent that first easy winter doing exactly what a good dog deserves after a hard year, sleeping by a warm stove, chasing rabbits across ground that finally, truly, belonged to the woman he'd guarded through all of it, and greeting every visitor to the mountain with the same watchful steady loyalty that had, in the end, found what 80 years of silence had failed to bury. The town of Larkspur Hollow, we should note, did eventually apologize to Eleanor Pruitt, in the particular way that towns manage such things, not with any single admission of wrongdoing, but with a slow collective softening, an invitation to the church social here, a compliment on her good sense there, until within a year or two, most of them spoke of her as though they had believed in her all along. Eleanor let them. She had learned, on that mountainside, that vindication doesn't require anyone else's permission to be real. There's a particular kind of justice in a story like this one, the kind that takes 80 years to arrive, and arrives anyway. Jedediah Marsh never got to tell his truth, but somewhere in a cabin he built with his own hands, he left it waiting for someone patient enough, and stubborn enough, and loved well enough by a good dog, to finally hear it. If you found a hidden piece of history like that, buried, forgotten, waiting 80 years for the right person to find it, would you keep it for yourself, or would you share it the way Eleanor did? Let us know below. Until next time, stay close.